We have reached the last paragraph of the chapter titled The Planes of Our Existence in the Synthesis of Yoga. In this chapter, Sri Aurobindo takes up the theme of the various levels of consciousness and the status and relationship of the Purusha and Prakriti, soul and energy of soul or nature. This he has taken up step by step, first describing the physical world, then the vital and the mental, and then in great depth and detail, the relationships between the physical and the vital, and equally then, by extension and suggestion, the relation between the mental, the vital, and the physical. In these paragraphs, we have found all the principles of occult knowledge, occult practices, and we have also understood why it is that we are not conscious of these planes and to what extent these planes act upon us and through us without our awareness. In particular, he dwelt on the knowledge of the other bodies that we have other than the physical. We live normally in the physical body and in the vitality that lives in the physical and the mind that has evolved in the physical. But all of this still belongs to the physical body and the physical experience. Through the physical senses, we then are aware of the physical world only. But we have a vital body of which we are not normally conscious, which opens to the vital worlds, and through the vital body, we are in relation with things of the vital worlds. Similarly, a mental body, and through the mental body, we are in relation with things of the mental worlds. Of these worlds also, Sri Aurobindo points out that the consciousness of a special focus of the vital or mental world is not separate from the physical, and it as if blends into below into the physical and upward into the higher ranges. And the same thing happens with the mental world also. And this was the last sentence we had read of the previous paragraph. There, that is in the mental world through which we connect, to which we connect through the mental body, there we find the psychical and mental heavens to which the Purusha can ascend when it drops the physical body and can there sojourn till the impulse to terrestrial existence again draws it downward. Here too, that is in the mental world, there are many planes, the lowest converging upon and melting into the worlds below, the highest at the heights of the mind power into the worlds of a more spiritual existence. And then the next paragraph, which we now take up, these highest worlds are therefore supramental. And this is very important. Therefore. Why therefore? The picture he has given us is from the mental worlds, which is itself made of many finer gradations. There is this turning downward, and he uses two words, lowest converging upon, and second word, melting into the worlds below. So from the mental world, there is a converging upon the lowest physical worlds, and there is a melting into the physical and vital worlds. These two words are very important because the same two words apply upward, where he says, the highest at the heights of the mind power into the worlds of a more spiritual existence. He doesn't repeat these two words, but they are implied. The highest converge upon and melt into worlds of a more spiritual existence. And these two words we have to understand more deeply, and then we will appreciate the word therefore. And he says, these highest worlds are therefore supra mental. The picture Sri Aurobindo has given us is not a neat, cut out, separate series of layers. What he shows is distinct gradations of consciousness, of experience of the Purusha, and the status of the Purusha in each of these. But all of these are part of a continuum blending into the rest of creation. And so, just as we have seen earlier, the close relationship between the vital and the physical worlds, so from the mental worlds, leaning towards the vital, he says, converging upon and melting into the worlds below, all the way down to the physical. So, convergence is when all the lines begin to gather towards a single point and finally touch at a single point. Now, that single point may not be a fixed position, but it may be a relative appearance also. So, in a painting that you draw on paper, if you have a grid of lines, let's say many roads which you see parallel to each other, or many lines which are parallel, they all converge upon the horizon. And the line of the horizon represents infinity in the distance. So it's as if these two parallel lines which never meet seem as if to meet at infinity. And the sense of convergence is this: it does not mean they actually meet. They tend as if to join, but may never actually join. And the suggestion here is this: when the mental plane and its lower ranges converge upon the vital and the physical, you have as if a series of narrowings, tendency towards vitalization, if we may use the term, or physicalization, that is acquiring increasingly the character of the life energy, or acquiring increasingly the sense of rigidity and closed bound dullness and heaviness of the material world. But as it increases, increasingly drifts towards that, as if approaching the horizon, there's a point beyond which you cannot distinguish anymore the vital or the physical. And so you never actually see the convergence joining and fixing in. It blends in a way that at some point you say, I do not recognize the mind anymore. It's vital only. Or it goes further, I do not recognize the mind anymore. It's physical already. This is the sense of the word converge. From the mental consciousness, it seems clearly as if it's joining with the vital and the physical. But when you actually shift layers and drift lower and lower, there's a point of transition after which you cannot distinguish anymore, and you lose the sense of the mind and you melt into. And that's where the second word comes: melting into the worlds below. And the sense of melting is different. It's as if, as you approach, it changes character. So let's say you have ice, it melts and becomes water. The transition seems to be sudden. It's either ice or it's water. But the ice can gradually melt. So the sense of convergence gives you the sense of continuity, of gradualness, but the sense of melting gives you a sense of transition between two different things, but it can melt more and more and more until eventually it is all gone. So there is a clear sense as you drift downwards that you are in a mental consciousness, but the mental consciousness now entering the vital worlds and vital regions, where increasingly the vital begins to predominate. You're aware of both things, mind and vital, mixed. And then there's a point where the vital takes over and you can barely feel the mind anymore. So the picture he has given us is fascinating, and with these two words, he has encapsulated two very important characteristics of this joining of the worlds. Based on these two characteristics is the whole knowledge of occult action or occult intervention from the mind upon the vital or upon the physical. There's a very interesting discussion that the mother has with the children. It tells them every time you have a strong thought or a strong emotion or will, it exercises an influence on circumstances. And that is an occult action. That is occultism. Very simply put, that's all there is to it. All the rest is really how you amplify, how you direct, specifics of knowledge, different kinds of interaction. It's all entering a world of complexities of this basic operation. But the question could be asked, how is it that your strong thought or emotion or will is eventually influencing, let's say, the life process inside the flower, or a material result in the physical world, in matter itself? If you are not conscious of a link between these two, as we are normally, we are not conscious of a link between our thinking and the material substance of the world, at least around us. And yet, we do notice, and increasingly with the growing medical knowledge and tools that we do notice that our thoughts have an effect on our body, and sometimes an immediate effect, and sometimes an effect so specific that by observing electrical signals in your brain, you can almost guess what kind of a thought you have. And this is a very interesting exercise which is being done, where there is something called fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, which allows you to see the activity in the brain in a three-dimensional manner. And it allows the person to be fully conscious without any sedation, any medicine, with this device placed around the head, monitoring the internal electrical working. But you're not really getting the electrical signals only, you're also monitoring the usage of sugar and oxygen in the brain. And there's something else which is called a Hall effect device, which measures electrical and magnetic variations, but is not so precise in pinpointing locations inside the brain. But a combination of these, and sometimes there are 256 of these devices all around, allows you to somewhat catch which area of the brain there is the electrical or magnetic shift. And with the combination of these two, you can map activity, but you don't really know what's happening in the brain. That's all you can make out. It's very crude compared to what should be possible eventually. But with that crudeness, you can ask a person to imagine a picture, a flower, a dog, a tree. And each time the person imagines a picture, you take a snapshot of the pattern in the brain. And over time, and over many specimens of human beings imagining similar objects, you build up with artificial intelligence a manner of recognizing the common pattern in all these. Having got to that, you can pick a fresh person who has not been so far tested, put this device around his head, and ask him to visualize whatever he wants and get some idea of what he's picturing. Literally reading the brain, not reading the mind, reading the brain, which is reflecting the mind's activity. You can, by observing which parts of the brain are active, get a sense of whether the person is currently imagining something or remembering something. A very easy way to recognize whether a person is lying. You ask him a question, what happened on that day? And if you see that his focus is on the part of the brain where he has to imagine, then you know he's lying. If the focus shifts to the part of the brain where there's memory, you know he's remembering. And these are things which are such powerful tools, even though the tools are still crude. You can also show images to the person, observing the brain response, and then after showing a variety of images and mapping all the brain responses, and again doing a commonality across many people, let the person go to sleep. And in sleep, as the person is dreaming and seeing images in dream, you can observe the brain response and correlate with the images that you've shown before and try to reconstruct what the person is seeing. That has not worked out too well, but it shows suggestions that perhaps we will be able to get some sense of pictures. Now, all of this is showing you a close connection between the mind's working and the physical brain at a very physical, chemical, and electrical level. And so the question would be very simple, restated in this way: how does the mind influence the biological matter of your brain? And if it can do that, why can it not influence the biological matter of the flower? And if it can do that, why can it not influence the non biological matter of stone? Because from here to stone is only the faded flower compacted, pretty much. So, suggestion here is this: what we are mapping in the brain is a part of biology which has already evolved sufficiently to become sensitive enough to mind pressure. It's a gradation of substance, we may use the term, which is as if physical and yet close enough to mind as to be responsive to mind. Or on the other side, from the mental body, a substance which is mental and yet sufficiently densified that it can begin to touch the physical. And if you think about it logically, both are necessary for the connection to form completely. If I want to move my hand, but it doesn't respond the same way as it used to, it has become sluggish. I want to feel the sensation, but it's not as sensitive as it used to be. The biological tissues, refined higher gradations of substance, have become as if less responsive or more dull, less fine. On the other side, also, the same problem can happen. In the mental body, if the part which densifies enough to plug into the physical body, if that part begins to lose its density, the mind will find itself drift breaking away. And even though it wants to stay connected to the physical body, it'll find itself helpless. It tries to hold, but the subtle hand goes right through the physical hand. I don't have the material density with which to plug in. Once we recognize how important these two movements of what he has used the word converging upon and melting into, substantially, then potentially we can now extend it to anything else. If we could train ourselves, for example, to consciously densify the mental substance, then it would be possible for the mind consciousness to plug into not just your biology and your brain, which is the most subtle, but to more dense parts of your biology, or even outside your physical biology, into the flower, perhaps. And your mental consciousness could sufficiently densify to connect to the mental consciousness or the vital consciousness or even the physical consciousness of the flower and feel, sense, or even act upon it. Or the same with our vital. If the vital consciousness can be sufficiently refined as to become responsive to the mental, then you will find your vital is now able to receive and hold much more the ideal that the mind holds, and the vital feels attracted to the ideal and feels called to fulfill it. If the vital loses that refined substance and becomes coarse and dull, then somebody speaks of these ideals and you say, what? Somehow it does not call to me. I don't feel a resonance because I don't have the material which is sufficiently refined. Or the same with the physical. From the vital, similarly, you could densify to connect to the flower and influence it. This could go so far, potentially, that you could project a part of your vital consciousness or your mental consciousness outside the range of your physical body and there densify it sufficiently that it acquires a physical character. This is what happens in certain kinds of seance where medium goes into a state of trance, and something of his or her body, subtler substance, is as if projected out of the physical body and made to be the medium in which some other being plugs into the physical world and can materialize and appear physically, or even interact with physical objects before releasing the connection and withdrawing or lapsing back into his normal grade of substance. And this substantiality of the medium's body is withdrawn into the medium, and the medium comes back to conscious awareness. You will remember the incident that Mother narrates, which was told to her by a scientist who was in such a seance. There had been a materialization, and the scientist reached out and grabbed the cloth of the materialized being and pulled at it, and a piece tore off. And of course, the medium screamed, not the person. The being which had materialized moved off and dematerialized. The medium screamed because of the shock, because it was material drawn from her substance, which had been the base for this being to materialize. Again, extending this knowledge a little further, a person could project out in the subtle body, so let's say a mental vital mix, and go out consciously in the subtle body on a different location, and then densify his substance willingly, consciously, until it acquires a material character, and there interact with material objects, do things, and then release the densification of done by the will to come back into the subtle body and return. The problem, though, is when you do that and your body, subtle bodies, matter is sufficiently densified, whatever happens to it there in that state is linked also to your physical body here and instantly reflects on your physical body. And Mother speaks of this. She says it's extremely dangerous. If you're injured there, then you will find the mark of the injury here. Something of this, she says, happens in dream state. If you're attacked and you're hurt, and someone asked this question, Mother, if someone kills us in the dream, there's no problem, right? Because the dream we think is just fantasy, hallucination. She said, oh my, not at all. It's very serious. If you have an injury there, it can appear in your physical body immediately. When you wake up, you notice it, but it happens instantly because your subtle body is connected most completely to your gross physical body. That link remains even after you've materialized there. So there is this one incident which was narrated to us by the person who was recording the mother's classes in the playground. And I don't know if it is available. I think the transcript is also there in mother's questions and answers. But in that, the full story is not given. And he described how mother was taking the class, and in the middle of the class, mid sentence, she stopped speaking and her head bent down. She went into deep trance, and she stayed in trance for 20 minutes about. At the end of which, her head comes up, she opens her eyes, and continues the sentence exactly where she left off, as if nothing happened, finishes the sentence, finishes the class, and then at the end of the class, she says, you must have seen me go into trance in between. And she explains why that happened. She said there was a yogi in the Himalayas who was in great mortal danger of life, and he prayed to the Divine Mother for help. And she says, because I'm here in this body, the call came to me. It's a very profoundly moving, personal observation. She need not have said it, but in saying it, she leaves us an important insight into what her physical body represents. And then she says, so I had to go and intervene. And in order to help him, she said she had to materialize herself. And so the part I missed was during those 20 minutes, the person said her body was shivering. And so mother explains that when she materialized her body in the Himalayas, it was very cold, and the shivering there registered on her physical body here in the playground. She does not reveal too much of what happened or what was necessary, what was the nature of the intervention, but that one incident, is not only relevant for what we have been discussing of the nature of this materialization that is possible, but it also tells us something more profound, that in her consciousness, the whole world was held. Every individual calling for help instantly receives a response from her. And if you consider her consciousness in this perspective, her shedding of this physical body makes no difference. She is exactly as she was then, still in that same consciousness in her total subtle and spiritual body, missing only this last physical projection in the physical world, which is all that we are obsessed with. We look at the physical form and say, oh, this is the mother. No, this is the tip of the iceberg, so to say, the most physical part of the projection of that which she really is, and that is always the same and still the same. And so our understanding of who the mother is and our relationship possible with her even today changes if we look at this incident more deeply. But coming back to the theme at hand, this capacity to materialize is interesting because there are degrees of materialization. There is a degree of materialization in which the person is seen visually, but if you put your hand out, it'll pass right through. It's like a projected image, like a hologram of light only. So there's a visual image, but not a physical substantiality. Or sometimes there is a physical condensation, more like a vital condensation, strong enough that you can feel the presence energetically and sometimes even touch, but you cannot see. It all depends on which aspect has been sufficiently densified, the more mental aspect or the more vital aspect of the subtle body. In the case of the more mental aspect, you see the image. In the case of the more vital aspect, you may feel the tangibility of the contact. And if both are sufficiently densified, you might find your hand going through what is felt almost like dense, smoky substance. It's semi transparent, but your hand is able to go right through. And up to this point, the person is not bound to physical gravity and can literally float. And when they transition beyond that to a more physical substantiality, that's when you'll find the weight increasing. Again, there's a continuity until the person becomes completely physical. And at that point, of course, is the greatest danger of harm if the person is injured. And at that point, the physical body of the person goes into what is called cataleptic trance, because the full consciousness has been concentrated at a physical level here. And that body goes into a state which is almost lifeless until this is released and the consciousness returns. If all this is possible, equally the reverse is possible. A physical object can be taken and then gradually dematerialized. That is, its material component is reduced and it is as if taken up into a subtler gradation of substance. In most cases, it is in the physical world still, material world, but in a higher gradation. Just as the vital worlds have many gradations, the mental have many gradations. He does not touch upon this here. The physical also has finer gradations, and it can move into these finer gradations of the physical world to a degree that you do not see it anymore. And then you'll say it's dematerialized, but it's still in the material domain. And then you move it easily, even at great distances. If that is taken more into the vital domain, that aspect becoming stronger, you can take it across great distances instantly and almost effortlessly. The effort is only in dematerializing partially, and then allowing it to rematerialize is almost a letting go of the will, and it snaps back to materiality. But in that intermediate state, you can shift location very easily. So there's an incident recorded in the book which I've mentioned before, Rolling Thunder, regarding a medicine man of the Native American tradition. And he is on a drive in his car going for some program, and he suddenly realizes he has left behind his tobacco pouch at his home, and that is sacred material which he needed for certain ceremonies, but they've gone too far. So the writer of the book sees him close his eyes and drift into a kind of sleep-like state, and after a while suddenly he wakes up and he's all cheerful, and he reaches into his pocket and pulls out his tobacco pouch, and he says, it's very easy to bring it back when you know where you have left it. Of course, if you don't know where it is, then you have to find out where it is, which takes a little more trouble. But all of this are very much in the domain of possibilities and part of potential human future evolution. The mother speaks of how certain objects that she had, including the notes that she made of the secret of life, were stolen from her. And she said it was an occult theft because she had kept it in a closed box, and then one day it was gone. And she knew who it was. It was Theon who had stolen it, but it was stolen through such a materialization process. In the theosophical literature, similarly, you will find a lot of interesting stories. In the early days, when they had close contact with the Himalayan masters who were guiding them, they would have a safe in which they would put a letter with questions. They would close the safe, and then later, when the number was only known to one person, he would come and open it. The letter they had written had gone, and instead there was another note with an answer written on it. So this letter is dematerialized, some other letter is materialized. It seems from the physical point of view almost magical, but if you think about the rationale of it, it's so simple, it's so obvious. Sitting where you are, if you know where that thing is, where the letter is put, you can project your consciousness into that safe, concentrate to feel the, let's say, paper, and then reach out by densifying your own vibrations, reach out to literally touch it in your consciousness. You do not need the hands anymore because it's your subtle body. You feel it, and then you grip it in your consciousness and then pull it up into a dematerialized state, sufficiently dematerialized that you can now literally pull out to where you are, bring it here. In the subtle world, distance, physical distance, has no relevance. It is affinity of energy that matters. So you've connected with it, and now it's here. There's no physical movement at all. It can be on another planet, it doesn't matter. It's here instantly, and here you let it lapse and it re-densifies itself. This is an interesting observation Mother makes. She says, so far, there has not been any materialization, true materialization, which has remained permanent. That is, an object which was not physical to begin with, which was mental or vital, has been materialized, densified to material vibration. Okay, so you have it, you can touch it, play around. Eventually, she says, it lapses back to its original state. Because the will which holds it down can only stand for so long. And she says typically it is within a year or two that it lapses back at most, often earlier. And that's because it belongs to that domain, and it is a will which is imposed to densify, and eventually the will loses its energy and it lapses back. And she says all other kinds of materialization, of course, are not real materializations, they are teleportations. As you know, there are many yogis, or I will use the word saints or magicians. Saintly magicians would be the right word, because they are more magicians than spiritual beings. They have a power to materialize or dematerialize, and they build a following often with that. So when they materialize and give you a watch or a piece of metal trinket of various kinds, it's not a real materialization. It's a teleportation. They have kept it in their room, it is dematerialized, brought here, and then given to you. So that stays. But a real materialization of an object which has never been in the physical world will not stay. It lapses back. And Mother explains The only true materialization which will be permanent will be that which is from the supramental action, from the supramental will. Because that is the true creator of all the worlds and of the material world also. Its will is not a little piece inside the totality of the cosmic will. Its will is an expression of the cosmic will, and therefore, whatever it wills is always in perfect alignment with the whole universe. And so, there is no compulsion or pressure of, let's say, will or circumstance to push it back to where it originally was. All of this is interesting because it represents, in a way, a technology, and a technology which is occult at present, but eventually will become perhaps an everyday appearance for at least a part of humanity. Or perhaps even before that, we might find means to do it by physical processes. After all, Sri Aurobindo observes this, whatever the consciousness can do directly in nature by direct action of will can be done by nature by a process of nature. It's a very profound statement. It means anything that the free consciousness can do, the spiritual consciousness can do by exercise of will in nature, can also be replicated by some process within nature, and which means a technology. By following this process, you will get this result. This, in fact, is the basis of a lot of magical formulae. You've caught a process in nature, but they may still be occult formulae. But in principle, you could find the same result by physical formula or many formulae physically. And this all belongs to a realm of technological exploration. A lot of this is already conceived of in science fiction, where you will see in Star Trek, you have these things, teleporting devices. You stand under it, push a button, and here you're dematerialized and materialized elsewhere, or you're pulled across, dematerialized there, and rematerialized here. These things are possible, in fact, even technologically. But the technology will be imitating what consciousness would do directly. It brings us to a finer nuance of the discussion, and maybe we'll stop with that. If nature can do it and consciousness can do it, what's the difference? Why not use nature's processes? If by a biological intervention you're able to make your body, let's say, more strong, more healthy, more young, why not do it? How would it compare with what Mother speaks of through a supramental transformation of the body, which would make it also effectively ageless, materially immortal, nowhere needing to age or die? What would be the difference? Well, there is one fundamental difference, and this is the point Sri Aurobindo makes. Yes, you can use all of nature's methods, but in the very act of using a method of nature, you are bound to her and you become her slave. Now you're dependent on that method. So, for example, in order to be able to move the flower from here to there, I have to exercise, extend my hand and move it. If you chop my hand, well, I cannot move it. Or if I have to move a very hot object, I need pincers, metallic pincers of a sufficient strength that they will not melt. So they are literally metallic objects with which you can scoop up molten lava. Now, if you make that out of iron, iron will melt because lava is a rock, iron almost. And so it would melt eventually. But you have metals which melt at much higher temperatures with which you can scoop up lava. But if you don't have that, you can do nothing. And this is the problem with occult methods, occult techniques or technologies. The occultist may have his wand or his crystal ball or his magic mirror or cape of invisibility or whatever it is you're used to seeing in cinema or in fantasy fiction. And yes, they all have truths behind them. But if his wand is broken, if his crystal ball is stolen, he becomes blind he becomes ineffective. The wand is really a physical device for focusing his will. And by training himself using the method of the wand and directing the will through the wand, preparing the wand in certain ways to amplify his will, well, he has achieved a certain result dependent on the wand. Now you steal the wand or break it, and the fellow says, I'm sorry, I can't do it anymore because I am ineffective. I need the technology. I need my mobile phone to make a call to somebody who's on the other side of the world, and I need in between the satellites which will bounce the signals. If you knock out the satellite, I cannot make my call anymore. But what is the phone doing? It's only transferring my thought through my speech, through these media of various kinds to transmit there. What consciousness can do directly by telepathy, you have done indirectly through nature's processes. You can make those processes more and more refined until they approach the direct means of consciousness. But as long as it is a means of nature used by technology or method, process of nature, you're dependent on nature. And if nature refuses you, or you lose the means of access to nature, well, effectively you have lost the ability. And if nature resists and says only this much and no more, well, that's all the capacity you have. And this is the problem with our biology. Nature says only this much and no more. After this, I'll start weakening your biology and your cells by habit. And so your body begins to age. You can't help it. You're willing it, but your will is not powerful enough. Your mental will is not powerful enough. But the difference in the transformation of consciousness is when your mind now becomes a supramentalized consciousness. No more mind with its limited capacity and relationship with matter and nature, but now the creative power of the divine is your status as the Purusha. From there, what you will on nature, nature cannot resist because she is the free power of the supramental consciousness. And so, what he wills is executed perfectly, without flaw, without pushback, without resistance, without needing any method and process, technique, or technology. And this is free action. That is bound action, limited action, where she rules you while seeming to yield to your will. This basic difference we have to recognize. And it is this which he now comes to in the very next paragraph. These highest worlds are therefore supramental. They belong to the principle of supermind, the free, spiritual, or divine intelligence, or gnosis, and to the triple spiritual principle of Satchidananda. From them, the lower worlds derive by a sort of fall of the Purusha into certain specific or narrow conditions of the play of the soul with its nature. So, this is where we see the difference now. At all of the lower levels, the Purusha is as if bound, more narrow, more limited status, where nature can compel. But here, in that poise, supramental, this principle of supermind, the free, spiritual, or divine intelligence, or gnosis. And all the other worlds are as if formed by a fall from this poise of freedom. So, the full scope of this we will look at perhaps the next time that we meet. But for now, since we're in this transition between the physical, vital, mental, and now the supramental, we I want to explore this relationship a little more. So the first point was this keyword he used, therefore. These highest worlds are therefore supramental. Why therefore? You saw how the mind has, as it turns down, there is this converging upon the vital and physical and melting into the vital and physical. In the same way, when it turns up, there is a converging upon and melting into higher ranges. But there's a point of transition after which you can no more call it mental because it converges upon something else other than mind. And so the only term you have for it is supra mental, beyond the mind. Or he uses the word super mind because it has a character, because we don't have another word for it. It has the character of knowledge, it has the power of will, it has the power of cognition, but of a different order altogether. So it can be called a super mind, but supra mental because it exceeds the mental in character. Sri Aurobindo has a footnote to this word divine intelligence called the Vijnana or Buddhi, a word which may lead to some misunderstanding as it is also applied to the mental intelligence, which is only a lower derivation from the divine gnosis. So he has used a series of terms: the principle of supermind, the free spiritual or divine intelligence. They are facets of intelligence: free intelligence, spiritual intelligence, divine intelligence, or gnosis, or triple spiritual principle of Sachidananda. Now, each of these terms you will find used all across the synthesis of yoga, in the life divine. Of course, he defines the terms as soon as he introduces them, but here he is making connections to the usage of each of these terms. What they mean, what they represent, we will look at in more detail another occasion. But for now, we'll just take this term supra mental. And what's the relationship between supramental, mental, vital, physical? And all of this we want to map to our own immediate human experience or whatever we can of it. Remember, so far in our study, we have been doing that. Right now, you're conscious primarily in your body of your life energy and your mind as it has evolved in your physical body. You're not conscious largely of your vital body or your mental body, of which perhaps you have a slight sense or a slight glimpse. You're not conscious of the ranges beyond, even of the higher ranges of the mind, and certainly not of your spiritual. And yet, through all of these, the influences pour into you. And that's all you're aware of. What passes from behind the veil to the surface part in your physical body and your awakened physical consciousness. That's all that you're conscious of. What then is this relationship and how can we internalize it to whatever extent? And we have a very interesting discussion of the mother in her classes from which I want to read. It's a long session of which we will take only two parts which are relevant to us. So she reads from her earlier classes. In some, let me first tell you the reference is 7th October 1953. She reads from an earlier class. In some, the aspiration moves on the mental levels or in the vital field. Some have a spiritual aspiration. Now, you see, she's speaking of an aspiration on three different levels: mental, vital, and spiritual. And so this will be the question on which she will elaborate. On the quality of the aspiration depends the force that answers and the work that it comes to do. So we all have an aspiration. Is it a mental, vital, or spiritual? And depending on that quality, there's a response from the divine. In all three cases, there's a response. But the kind of response or the quality of response is different, and the force is different. To make yourself blank in meditation creates an inner silence. It does not mean that you have become nothing or have become dead and an inert mass. Making yourself an empty vessel, you invite that which shall fill it. It means that you release the stress of your inner consciousness towards realization. The nature of the consciousness and the degree of its stress determines the forces that you bring into play and whether they shall help and fulfill or fail or even harm and hinder. Now, this she has read from her questions and answers of 1921, 1929, 23rd June. Having read this, somebody asks, What is the difference between mental aspiration, vital aspiration, and spiritual aspiration? And now, what she will reply, you will see immediately we can map it to something of our daily experience of life. It will give us a context of relationship of these four levels also on a practical level, accessible. She says, in what way do you aspire in the mind and in the vital, or aspire spiritually? A mental aspiration means that the thought power aspires to have knowledge, for instance, or else to have the power to express itself well, or have clear ideas. So you can see when you want this, it's a part of your awareness of mind which wants. A logical reasoning. One may aspire for many things, and all the faculties and capacities of the mind may be developed and placed at the service of the divine. This is a mental aspiration. So you want to develop your mind awareness in various ways and put it at the service of the divine. Or you may have an aspiration in the vital. If you have desires or troubles, storms, inner difficulties, you may aspire for peace, to become quite impartial without desire or preference, to be a good, docile instrument without any personal whims, always at the divine's disposal. This is a vital aspiration. So you see, she's giving you a reference of the various facets in the vital consciousness through which it enters in relation to the divine. You may have a physical aspiration also, that the body may feel the need to acquire a certain kind of equipoise in which all the parts of the being will be well balanced, and that you may have the power to hold off illness at a distance or overcome it fast when it enters trickily, and that the body may always function normally, harmoniously, in perfect health. That is a physical aspiration. A spiritual aspiration means having an intense need to unite with the divine, to give oneself totally to the divine, not to live outside the divine consciousness, so that the divine may be everything for you in your integral being. And you feel the need of a constant communion with Him, of the sense of His presence, of His guidance in all that you do, and of His harmonizing all the movements of the being. That is a spiritual aspiration. Someone asks, Mother, does aspiration come from the psychic? Mother, not necessarily. Each part of the being can have its own aspiration. Question, how can the physical manage to aspire, since it is the mind that thinks? So now we come to the distinction of aspiration as distinct from thought. Mother, as long as it is the mind that thinks, your physical is something that's three-fourths inert and without its own consciousness. There is a physical consciousness proper, a consciousness of the body. The body is conscious of itself and it has its own aspiration. So long as one thinks of one's body, one is not in one's physical consciousness. The body has a consciousness that's quite personal to it and altogether independent of the mind. The body is completely aware of its own functioning or its own equilibrium or disequilibrium, and it becomes absolutely conscious in quite a precise way if there is a disorder somewhere or other. And, how shall I put it? It is in contact with that and feels it very clearly, even if there are no external symptoms. The body is aware if the whole working is harmonious, well balanced, quite regular, functioning as it should. It has that kind of plenitude, a kind of plenitude of joy and strength, something like the joy of living, acting, moving in an equilibrium full of life and energy. So, what she is pointing to, and this is the difference we have. You can say, I'm thinking about my body or I'm feeling my body, but from a mind awareness. Yeah, it feels hot, it feels heavy, it feels tired. but it's mind looking at body or feeling body. What she's describing is literally getting into the body consciousness and feeling what the body feels in itself. And that's the part where often we feel, somehow today I'm feeling a little queasy, I don't know what's wrong. And then the mind brings an association with another memory. Maybe I might catch a cold. But that's the mind now drawing that knowledge. But inside the body itself, you feel something queasy. It does not have a clear form, but it feels it has moved out of its balance of harmony. At that point, if instead of thinking, you try to feel in the body consciousness what it's like to recover the harmony, you can literally shift the state of your body back to harmony, and the thing is corrected. So the working in the body consciousness is a whole different training in itself, quite different from the mind. So she continues, or else the body can be aware that it is ill treated by the vital and the mind, and that this harms its own equilibrium, and it suffers from this. That may produce a complete disequilibrium in it, and so on. One can develop one's physical consciousness so well that even if one is fully exteriorized, even if the vital goes completely out of the body has a personal, independent consciousness which enables it to move, to do all kinds of very simple things without the vital being quite there, quite independently. The body can learn how to speak. The mind and the vital may be outside it, very far away, busy elsewhere. But due to the link joining them with matter, they can still find expression through a body wherein there is no mind or vital, and which yet can learn to speak and repeat what the others say. You see, what she's describing is something which is not in our normal range of experience. She's saying the vital and the mental can be out and an out of body experience. Normally, the body would be asleep. But here, the body can be taught to actually function, even to speak, to converse, and do basic, simple things. And she says, the body can move. I don't mean that it can exert much, but it can move. It can do small, very simple things. It can write, for instance, learn how to write as it can learn to speak. It does speak a little, how to put it, slowly, with a little difficulty, but still it can speak clearly, sufficiently clearly for one to understand. And yet, the mind and vital may have gone out altogether, maybe completely outside. There is a body consciousness. And so, when one has developed this body consciousness, one can have a very clear perception of the opposition between the different kinds of consciousness. So, we'll just digress from this with an example. You see, when the mother is describing this, I'm going to take a couple of examples to show how far this can go. There is an incident in the life of Madame Blavatsky. You know, she was a very developed occultist with extraordinary capacities, and she would often be out of her body, working on other worlds, and increasingly in her later part of life, she would be like that. And she had almost as if lost the grip on her physical body because she was so busy on those worlds. At some point, she had given instructions that things should not be disturbed while she's doing her work. And so she was doing her normal routine of life. Somebody had moved a stool, and she walks right into the stool and stumbles and falls, injuring herself. And so the people with her said, but couldn't you see the stool has moved? She said, I told you never move things around without my explicit instructions. And she said, because I was actually out there in a different domain on this vital or mental worlds, and the body was doing its job of life automatically. You know, you get up, you take a shower, brush your teeth, put on your clothes, and all that. Maybe even write things, simple things, but it can be done completely automatically by the body consciousness. But it stumbled because the mind was not there to assist in this navigation around a changed physical situation. And I had read this long ago, and I found it interesting. And then one day we were interviewing one of mother's attendants, And he told us the same thing. He said, Mother was extremely strict that nothing in her room should be moved or touched. You had to dust it, put it back exactly as it is, and that's it. Nothing to be moved. Some of it, of course, had to do with an occult action. She had next to her a kind of a lounge like bed where she would lean. She had next to it many little animals, stuffed animals, which had been given to her. And they were each of them special, into which she had connected to certain beings. And sometimes she would keep certain objects. There was a place where she would keep certain papers, she explains in the agenda, things on which she has to work. So someone has sent a letter and something has to be done. She would keep that letter there because it was a point of focus on which she would be putting her energy to work on those things. And someone, I think it was Bansidhar at that point, one day took out one of the papers and put it somewhere else. And she shouted at him. He said, I was so surprised. And when he was telling us this, he didn't have an explanation. I was so surprised. Why is mother so angry? I've just moved an object. And another time he says, I was cleaning a vase and it fell from my hand and it broke. And mother just said, oh, and she didn't scold me. And for something so serious, she's scolding. For something so serious, she doesn't scold. And here I moved a paper from here to there and she was shouting at me. He didn't understand. But you see the reason, you can break the vase. It doesn't change anything for her work. But if the paper which was placed for a certain purpose is moved out, it may have ramifications on the work she was doing on other levels. And sometimes there were physical objects through which she would act on material circumstances also, and on people. And perhaps it was a suggestion from a being, mischievous being in Bansidhar's mind, to move that paper out, and which was to interfere with her work. But all this reminded me of that incident, because we do know for a fact that in the later years, when the mother was working on her physical body and the transformation of the physical cells, often she would be in these states where she would be concentrated in certain other worlds or very high states of consciousness, and the body would do its work almost as a routine which had been set. And she observes here that sometimes it speaks a little slowly, but this technique or capacity to connect to speech she had developed when she was training in occultism, when she left her body, not once, not twice. So you can leave your body and go into your subtle body. It's a big deal for us. From the subtle body, you can further leave the body and come out into something still subtler. This is mastered only by the most advanced occultists. And we don't know too many who are capable of that. I believe Madame Blavatsky has mentioned that she was able to do that. Then you can leave that and go out once more. I've not heard of that in any literature that I have seen. And Mother says she went through that process of leaving one body for the next, all the way 12 times, until she reached the highest edge of creation where form and the formless meet. Now, that capacity to go all that way, normally, even if you go 2 levels up, your body goes into cataleptic trance, which means it cannot move. Your breathing slows down to become almost practically nil. Your heartbeat slows down to something like 1 pulse a minute. Effectively, if someone put a finger on the pulse, they would say dead. Except the body doesn't decompose because the link is there and the energy flows through that link. But the consciousness is withdrawn completely. Now, she went into that state, got through 2, 3, 4. Already the body would be normal in a cataleptic trance. But she mentions how she developed the capacity to be able to keep the link with the body through speech. That being in those domains, she could dictate things. And this is a technique which was also known to Madame Théon, who was her teacher. And she would do that. She would go into those domains and then she would dictate what she was seeing, what she was doing, and Mother would transcribe at that point. Because the body cannot write from that state, but it could speak. And these notes Mother prepared, and that was part of the work she was doing to assist her. But Mother developed the same capacity, and it was in one such out of body state, going high up, many levels up, that Madame Theon and the mother were both on that level, and Madame Theon saw the mother in that form, in her subtler form, and she saw above her head 12 pearls. And so she said, she, she said to her, "You are that," meaning you are the Divine Mother. She recognized that formation of the 12 pearls, which was a distinctive symbol of the divine incarnation. And the Mother mentions this again in passing, as if it's something casual. But beyond that, to go further higher up to higher ranges, leaving 12 bodies, even Madame Theon was not capable of. It's something which the mother was able to do, and all the way to the highest level, keeping the link to be able to speak. And there's the whole description. We don't need to go too much into detail. It's at that point that she saw the prototype of the supramental form. And it was there that Theon was with her at that time to protect from attack. And he asked her to reveal to him the secret of life, which was found on that level. And Mother refused to. He was very upset and he tried to cut off the link and so on. The link once cut, you cannot return. Effectively, you are dead, as they say, because your body is already in cataleptic trance. So in his anger, he cut the link and then later regretted and forced it back. But it was a very painful passage. All these experiences Mother had to go through, which she barely, very superficially documents in some of her discussions in the agenda. But it shows you the range of experiences that she had to have in her human incarnation. And what we have is barely a superficial glimpse of it, but that glimpse gives you the sense of the range, to be able to have gone through all these different kinds of experiences and these worlds. And then she says later she noted on a paper what it was that was the secret of life. Now, what it was she noted is not known to us. Was it in this form of a sound? Was it in the form of a symbol or a particular formulation of what was experienced? But she had noted it. And then she said once it was lost, and then she wrote it a second time and kept it. And that time it was stolen by Theon using this method of dematerialization. But all this is to describe to you that one can go out all the way, and still she was able to maintain the link so that the body could speak. And this is to show you that even when all the consciousness is pulled out at its most material level, the body can still retain and can be trained to hold its individuality. When the body needs something, we continue with the text, and is aware that this is what it needs, and the vital wants something else and the mind yet another, well, there may very well be a discussion among them, and contradictions and conflicts. And one can discern very clearly what the poise of the body is and the need of the body in itself, and in what way the vital interferes and destroys this equilibrium most often and harms the development so much because it is ignorant. And when the mind comes in, it creates yet another disorder which is added to the one between the vital and the physical, by introducing its ideas and norms, its principles and rules, its laws and all that. And as it doesn't take into account exactly the needs of the other, it wants to do what everybody does. Human beings have a much more delicate and precarious health than animals because their mind intervenes and disturbs the equilibrium. The body, left to itself, has a very sure instinct. For instance, never will the body, if left to itself, eat when it doesn't need to, or take something which will be harmful to it. And it will sleep when it needs to sleep, it will act when it needs to act. The instinct of the body is very sure. It is the vital and the mind which disturb it. One by its desires and caprices, the other by its principles, dogmas, laws, and ideas. And unfortunately, in the civilization as it is understood, with the kind of education given to children, this sure instinct of the body is completely destroyed. It is the rest that dominate. And naturally, things happen as they do. One eats things that are harmful, one doesn't take rest when one needs to, or sleeps too much when it is not necessary, or does things one shouldn't do, and spoils one's health completely. There's the example recently I read of a child who, from the age of 2, was only eating chips and fried foods or junk foods. And by the age of 20, had such a severe deficiency that he had gone completely blind, and various other powers of the body were on the brink of collapse. And he couldn't change. He could not eat anything else because from the age of 2, the body's instinct had been overridden by the vital greed. And that's it. So we skip now. There are other discussions she has. And we now come to the link. So we've looked at the physical aspiration, vital aspiration, mental aspiration, and the link to the spiritual. Of course, there was the spiritual aspiration, but the link to the supramental. And so we come to this now. And in the same text, at the end, Mother is reading now, again from the 1929 text, and then she comments on it. First, she reads, "The supramental does not take interest in mental things in the same way as the mind. It takes its own interest in all the movements of the universe, but it is from a different point of view and with a different vision. The world presents to it an entirely different appearance. There is a reversal of outlook, and everything is seen from there as other than what it seems to the mind, and often even the opposite. Things have another meaning, their aspect, their motion and process. Everything about them are watched with other eyes. Everything here is followed, that is, everything in the world, is followed by the supermind, the mind movements, and not less the vital, the material movements. All the play of the universe has for it a very deep interest, but of another kind." Now, look at each of these things we have seen, each of these parts we have seen, and each of them distinctly has its own perspective. What is the perspective of the supramental? And that's what we're coming to. And so the person asks, someone asks, in what does the supermind take interest? So she has said two things. First, there's a complete reversal, and it has a different way of looking at it, and its interest is totally different also. And all the things, movements, objects, processes, everything is taken, but keenly interest, but in a different view. So first recognize what is the difference of consciousness. While all mind, vital, and physical are finite, first of all. Your mind has a boundary. Your vital has a limit. Your body has an edge. The supermind is fundamentally infinite. It cannot be made finite. It is essentially infinite. Second difference is that mind, vital, physical is always cut off from something else. There is this, there is that, there is the other. Everything is made of pieces. So in the physical world, you have a flower, you have a leaf, you have a petal, and the petals joining together make the flower. The flower is separate from the plant, which is separate from the rock, etc. Everything is pieces joined together or parted and joined. In the vital, it's not so easily separated, and yet they are distinct. I have a state where I'm happy, I have a state where I'm sad, and the two are opposite. Or in the thought, you have ideas, and you have contrary ideas, and you have large ideas and small ideas, but more fluid, and yet pieces. When you step into the supramental, there is only oneness. There is no separation. There is no division. There is only one indivisible oneness, which is whole, complete, nothing left out, all included in the whole. So the first thought we have is the mind thinks, but then it must be a monotone flat, quite boring. No, it is one indivisible whole which can look at itself from an infinity of perspectives, infinitely rich in perspectives of its own oneness and experiences of itself, and infinitely rich. Remember, it is consciousness of infinity, so its richness also is infinite in the sense that you can know it this way, that way, that way, that way, that way, unendingly, and scales in different hierarchies of infinities, unendingly infinite in possibilities of self knowledge. And so it can pour out all its experiences, and after it has poured out an infinity of experiences, there's still an infinity waiting to manifest. And it is rich, diverse, complex, beyond conception of anything the mind can think of in terms of infinities and possibilities. Compared to that richness and oneness, this is a pale reflection. So it's very interesting. You have infinity, you have oneness, which is indivisible, and yet you have infinite multiplicity. Now, what does such a consciousness, which knows everything because nothing is left out, which can do everything because all is itself and there is nothing other than it to oppose it, what does such a consciousness view the world from in its perspective? What is important for it? What is interesting for it? That's the question being asked to her. In what does the supermind take interest? Mother. It takes interest in the transformation of the world. Very interesting. Goes straight to the heart of it. It takes interest in the transformation of the world, in the descent of forces in the material world and its transformation, in its preparation so that it may be able to receive the supramental forces. So, what will its single most important focus be? Well, fulfilling all the infinite possibilities which are waiting to manifest. And in the material world, it sees all this blindness and limitation and all the things which prevent all the infinite possibilities from manifesting, and it wants to transform and it wants to bring in these forces and assist that whole process. And she says, and it is conscious of the difference between the world as it is and the world as it ought to be. You see, in the supramental consciousness, since all is included, all space, all time, all possibilities in all of space and time is also there in its one single vision. So when it looks at the physical world as it is, or the world, the whole world as it is, it sees and knows at the same time what it can be and all the things it can be and what is the highest fulfillment also at the same time. So it's literally as if you take a seed and you can see the full journey of the seed into the plant and all the flowers and all the seeds which will come from its fruits and all the plants which will come from those seeds and everything in a single glance as it looks at the seed. And so when it looks at the whole world, it sees all of this flowering that is still waiting. And so it is, she says, and it is conscious of the difference between the world as it is and the world as it ought to be. So you see, it's not a monotone, it's like this, it should be like that. No, it sees the full spectrum of possibilities. Every moment it sees the gulf between what is and what should be, between the truth and the falsehood that is expressed. And constantly it keeps this vision of the truth which broods over the world, so that as soon as there is a little opening, it may descend and manifest itself. Now, again, look at it this way: the supramental consciousness, being all inclusive, embraces the world from all directions, from inside out of every single thing in the universe. And it sees and knows the falsehood from inside it. And the moment there's a slightest opportunity, a gap, poof, it pushes itself. Nudge, 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 nudge. And so when you look at the complexity of the world situation, it is present inside everything, and every opportunity it nudges, pushes, nudges, pushes. But each of its little nudges and pushes is perfectly synchronized with all of itself, because it is one consciousness, not two pieces, not two arms, but one single movement nudging through so many. And so always coordinated and always spontaneous in the outcome. But it has to go through these little gaps, so to say. As soon as there is a little opening, it may descend and manifest itself. And what to the ordinary awareness seems quite natural is for it usually a play of obscure, ignorant, altogether unconscious forces. It sees all this unconscious forces. And it does not find that at all natural. It finds that a detestable accident and tries with all its strength to remedy it. It seeks, looks, and if there is any receptivity anywhere, it intensifies its action. It does not see men in their outward appearance, but as vibrations, more or less receptive and more or less dark or luminous. And wherever it sees a light, it projects its force so that it may have its full effect. Now, remember this. Mother is describing this. It's the consciousness in which she lives, it's the consciousness from which she acts. So she's not just describing the supramental as a thing separate, it is her view of things in the world. And that was the problem for human beings around her, because they couldn't understand why she behaved this way with someone and that way with another, often in the same situation, a different behavior. And they could not recognize this view and approach of the supramental. And instead of treating each being like a pawn on a chessboard, a small, well defined person, it sees how forces enter, go out, stir, move, and make all things move, how vibrations act. And it sees those vibrations which ascend and lead to progress, and it sees those vibrations which cast you further and further into the darkness, which make you go down. And at times, someone comes to you with ready-made words which he has learned generally from books, but nevertheless full of aspiration and goodwill, and he is answered by a strong rebuff and told that he should try to be sincere. He does not understand. You see, she's giving examples literally of how she's intervening with certain people. This is because the force sees that there is no sincerity. The force does not see the words, does not hear the words, doesn't even see the ideas in the head, but only the state of consciousness. Whether the state of consciousness is sincere or not. So there were many examples with the mother where somebody came and they said all the right words and mother said no. And they said, but what is this? And it created a lot of confusion among people who had to deal with that. And what mother was responding to what was that state of insincerity. You see, a lawyer can use all the rules of the law to commit a crime and get away with it. And the intention being insincere, you can fit into the scheme of all the right words and structures and laws, but the supramental will say no. Or equally the reverse. If there is sincerity, even if you're doing the wrong words, it'll help you come out of that confusion and lead you through the light. There are examples where people who wanted to do good were just snubbed like that. And I remember, I think it was Narad who narrated how he had planned to make something very beautiful, taking some of the quotations from the mother and from Sri Aurobindo and the paintings which Huta had done. He wanted to project them in a certain way. All the ideas were there. And Huta had reported to the mother that he's going to mix this and that. And mother wrote a very strong note, or she spoke in very strong words, no fancy should mix into this, something like that. And Narad said he got the letter and it hit him hard. And the whole thing stopped, whatever he was doing. And he never understood for a long time what it was. Why was mother so harsh when the whole thing was moving so beautifully? And of course, in time as the inner being matures, you may not be able to explain rationally what it was, but you understand, yes, that action helped to break through certain things and develop something much more deep, much more true and complete. And maybe it postponed a short term benefit for a much deeper and long term outcome. She continues, there are other instances of people who seem to be quite frivolous and stupid and busy with useless things, and suddenly one helps them, encourages them, treats them like friends and comrades. For one sees shining in the depth of all that a sincerity, an aspiration, which may have a childish form outwardly, but which is there and very pure at times. There was the example of a person who came to the ashram with wearing military clothes. He was, I think, from the Air Force. Everybody was, or the army, everybody was making a big deal of it. And mother met him with great affection, showered him with love. And afterwards, when he went a few days later, there was a news item that he had been arrested for impersonating. He was not at all from the military. He just put on the clothes to get benefits. And so mother was asked, Mother, didn't you know this? She says, yes. But when he first came in front of me, his inner being leaped out, weeping. She said, what could I do? So she gave him all the love, all the affection, not to this false personality, but to the inner being, which was weeping, to be free from this imprisonment of a perverse and false personality. So this is what she is describing here. So outwardly, there are forms which could be anything, but inside, that's what she's seeing. And so one does many things for them which people don't understand, for they cannot see the reality behind the appearance. That is why I say that it is in an entirely different way that the supermind is interested, an entirely different way that it sees, an entirely different way that it knows. There's another question which follows, which is extremely important, but I don't think we will have time to go through it in detail, but we'll just read some part of it. The questioner says, isn't it more important to know oneself than to try to know others? Mother, very important, of capital importance. Besides, that's the field of work given to each one, to know yourself. It is this one must understand, that each one, this totality of substance constituting your inner and outer body, the totality of substance with which your being is built from the outermost to the inmost, is a field of work. Now we're going to connect it to the text that we have just read. Remember, you have your physical body, your vital body, mental body, and maybe finer gradations of the mental, and then there is still higher, the spiritual ranges, of which we are not conscious at all. And all of this has been as if woven together to form this individual personality. Okay? So the totality of the substance, the outer body, the inner and outer body, the totality of substance with which your being is built, from the outermost to the inmost, is a field of work. It is as though one had gathered together carefully, accumulated a certain number of vibrations, and put them at your disposal for you to work upon them fully. So each one of us is a gathering of a particular combination of vibrations, and this is the field on which we are required to work, meant to work. It is like a field of action constantly at your disposal, night and day, awake or asleep, all the time. Nobody can take it away from you. It is wonderful. You see, we all complain. If only I had a proper gym, I would do my exercises. If only I had a swimming pool, I could go and swim. If only I had a palatial building, then I could do this. I need things from outside me to do things for my growth. No, that's not true. Everything needed for your growth is already given to you, and nobody can take it away from you. And so you could be left all alone, as Sri Aurobindo was, in solitary confinement in jail. and all other external devices being taken away from him, he deepened the working on himself. And that's when he wrote that poem called Invitation, which describes a whole scene out there in the wild of nature, with wind and the weather beating round me. Up to the hill and the moorland I go. Who will come with me? Who will climb with me? Wade through the brook and tramp through the snow? Not in the petty circle of cities, cramped by your doors and your walls, I dwell. The whole poem is very deeply symbolic, of course, but all this is describing in a state of physical solitary confinement where there's barely enough space for him to lie down flat. He has to actually crouch his knees slightly to be able to lie down in the jail cell, and for weeks together. But the field of action, nobody can take away. You can take away everything else. So, and she says, it is wonderful. You may refuse to use it, as most people do, but it is a mass to be transformed that is there in your hands, fully at your disposal, given to you, so that you may learn to work upon it. So, the most important thing is to begin by doing that. You can do nothing for others unless you're able to do it for yourself. Think about it. How can you help someone with something if you don't have already the thing which is needed for the other? You can never give a good advice to anyone unless you're able to give it to yourself first and to follow it. And if you see a difficulty somewhere, the best way of changing this difficulty is to change it in yourself first. If you see a defect in someone, you may be sure it is in you, and you begin to change it in yourself. And when you will have changed it in yourself, you will be strong enough to change it in others. And this is a wonderful thing. People don't realize what an infinite grace it is that this universe is arranged in such a way that there is a collection of substance, from the most material to the highest spiritual, all that gathered together into what is called a small individual, but at the disposal of a central will. And that's what we are. All this material, literally the whole cosmos and all the layers gathered, and with a will in the center. That's Agni, the will which is leading the whole journey of evolution. But you see the point she makes. As a cosmos miniaturized, we are a microcosm. You have a problem out there, it is reflected equally and represented in you. You can't fix it outside unless you fix it first inside. But it doesn't mean, as many people say, oh, you take care of yourself, don't criticize others, don't interfere with others. It's not that. She says you have to change things outside. That's part of our work. But you cannot be effective in the external change if you have not made that correction first internally. Or your effectuation there will be limited, or it will be temporary. The moment the situation changes, you will lose it because the core problem is not resolved in your means to be able to effect outside you. And when you are corrected internally, you have the means now to impact. And that's a new skill you'll develop, how to exercise from within you to outside you. But first, it has to be done within, then only this can be exercised fully. Of course, you cannot say, until I am fully purified and transformed and divine, I will not act in the world. It doesn't work like that either. So there's always a double action, an internal correction, and then it's action outside, and you go back and forth. And every now and then outside you, something fails, something slips. You look at what it is inside you that needs correction, and then again you re engage. And so it's as if, in another place, she says, life is like a mirror. It reflects what you are internally. And all your external actions are, in a sense, an attempt to correct something internally. Equally, until you have corrected internally, you cannot correct outside you. But at the disposal of a central will, you do not have the central will in the universe. The central will is within you. So you have to start here, and changing here, you will be able to change everywhere eventually. And that is yours, your field of work. Nobody can take it away from you. It is your property. And to the extent you can work upon it, you will be able to have an action upon the world. but only to that extent. One must do more for oneself besides than one does for others. You can go out as if to escape from the world to work on yourself. But even if you go out, where do you go? You go to a forest, you go to a cave. Eventually, you connect to the animals there and other life forms. You cannot really escape, she says. There are atmospheres one cannot escape. It is certain, for I know this by experience, it is certain that there is a degree of individual perfection and transformation which cannot be realized without the whole of humanity having made a particular progress. And this happens by successive steps. There are things in matter which cannot be transformed unless the whole of matter has undergone a transformation to a certain degree. One cannot isolate oneself completely. It is not possible. One can do the work, one can choose. There are people who have chosen to go into solitude and try to realize in themselves the ideal they saw. Usually they reached a certain point, then stopped there. They could go no further. It has been thus historically. I was saying the other day, and she quotes herself, there are perhaps people upon earth whom I don't know who have realized extraordinary things. End quote. And she says, but precisely because they have isolated themselves from the earth does not know them. This is just to say that nothing is impossible. It seems doubtful, is all that I can say. That is, someone asks, can we isolate ourselves and just do that? But it is impossible, even if one isolates oneself physically, to do so vitally and mentally. There is the vast terrestrial atmosphere in which one is born, and there's a sort of spirit or genius of the human race. And so she says you can't isolate yourself from that. Physically you could, but vitally and mentally you cannot. And this is a very important point. There's a spirit or genius of the human race to distinguish from other beings, other species. So, human race as distinct from other animal races, other animal species, but also from other mental races and species, perhaps from other planets, which may be human like, which may have a mentally developed consciousness, but their species, their genius of the species might have a different goal, different objectives. And you may meet them, you can have very interesting conversations and many common features, but the species consciousness is distinct enough, you will feel, but our goal is different, they have different priority. So there's a sort of spirit or genius of the human race. Well, this genius must have reached a certain degree of perfection for anyone to be able to go farther. It is not that one has to wait till all have done it. No. But it is as though all had to reach a certain level for one to be able to take one's spring and go farther. Surely, the individual will always be ahead of the mass. There's no doubt about that. But there will always be a proportion and relation. And that's why we can say there are stages in human evolution. In the Vedic age, the rishis went as far as they could. Beyond that, humanity was not ready. But what they set in their highest was the prototype for the next phase of human evolution, which we are now concentrating upon. But to go beyond that, it needed a sufficient emergence of humanity to come to a level of mental development that made possible now the glimpse of a complete physical transformation and divinization, which is now set as the ideal for which the rishis are Sri Aurobindo and the mother, who have set that as the prototype, worked it upon themselves in their own physical body, and to that extent imprinted the capacity or possibility in humanity. And this defines the new age and the new evolution that has to take place. And of course, as a result of this push and the tremendous spiritual afflatus which is lifting humanity, there is also the opposite that happens. And I'm reading from the same class towards the end. She speaks of how there has been a deterioration because of the vital forces entering Earth atmosphere. And she says, There was a general deterioration from the vital point of view. She's speaking of the phase just after the war, I think. I could say, which was inevitable even for those who consciously knew whence the force came, whence the deterioration came, and who could therefore fight against it consciously. They could not prevent certain effects being produced in the Earth atmosphere. Naturally, men do not know what happened to them. All that they have said is that happened, that everything had become worse since the war. That was all that they could affirm. For example, the moral level went down very much. It was simply the result of a formidable descent of the vital world. Forces of disorder, forces of corruption, forces of deterioration, forces of destruction, forces of violence, forces of cruelty. Someone asks, why this descent from the vital world? Mother, perhaps it was a reaction, for there was another force, capital F, coming down which wanted to do its work. And perhaps those forces did not want it. It disturbed their habits. It is like a government which fears that it will be thrown out and so intervenes violently in order to keep in power. And that's it. That's the end of the class. Now, this last portion is very relevant again, very interesting in the context of what we're discussing. When the supramental action descends from above, all these lesser forces are destabilized. Just as when mind descends into life and body, we read that portion where she says the physical body loses its balance, the vital loses its balance and rhythm, because mind came and it has now imposed itself. But mind brings disorder because it does not know vital and physical. But when the supramental comes, it is the origin of all the worlds. It knows mind as itself, as a special projection. It knows vital as a special projection. It knows the physical as a special projection. And so it is the only power descending which on entry can actually harmonize everything. But in the very first movement, as it begins to harmonize everything, these worlds of the mental, vital, and their habits, as she has called it, their habitual way, their habitual rule, their government, so to say, is suddenly destabilized from their habit. Not recognizing they will be taken up into a greater harmony, but what they experience first is the loss of their hegemony. And so they oppose, and sometimes violently oppose, and assert their will and their chaos to try to prevent that supramental manifestation. And that's what we are seeing here. Mother puts it in a different way, in a different context. She says, as the supramental descends, it pushes all the other worlds, and so they get destabilized and they get into a kind of a reaction. But all of this was, in a sense, to be expected in the very nature of that supramental descent. We look at material processes and we get lost in circumstances saying, this happened and so chaos came. No, it's a much bigger picture. And unless we keep the bigger picture of this chapter in mind, the mental worlds, the vital worlds, and their influences on the physical worlds, their influences upon us through the mental and vital bodies, we will not understand this observation and the nature of the crisis today, the nature of the transition, and the nature of the solution, which is also demanded of us, which, simply put, is to align ourselves as completely and as exclusively as possible with the divine will. As possible. We start with what little we can. But the more we are able to, the more that action of harmonization begins to act. And as we read, slips through the cracks, catches these moments of light or these centers of light and pockets and begins to work through them. And it is entering a domain which, from its perspective, is all mostly darkness and chaos and confusion, inertia, inconsciousness. And it's leaking in, creeping in, pushing in wherever it finds little points and begins to act to change all this into a manifestation of its light and a harmony of the divine will. And this is inevitable. And Sri Aurobindo says, in the very nature of things, the supramental manifestation is inevitable. Well, because it is the master of all this and the origin and source of all this. And so it is inevitable. The question is only the transition from here to there. And for that, the more the points of light, the more centers of conscious awareness, of aspiration to the divine, the spiritual aspiration, the mental aspiration, the vital aspiration, even the physical aspiration, the more these grow, the more it can act through these centers and through the aspiration, bringing into it a higher response and working through it its harmonizing influence. That's why Mother said, depending on your aspiration is the response and the result. And so this is the work before us. And the immediate focus of that work is, of course, our being, which we now recognize actually contains all of these levels of consciousness that exist in the universe. Not all fully developed and not all fully organized, but well, that's part of the evolutionary process. And so in this paragraph we have just now begun, he speaks of what is above mind, the supramental ranges, what that means, the principle of supermind, free spiritual divine intelligence, gnosis, triple principle of Sachidananda, from which the lower worlds are derived. And again, he says, as with earlier parts of the discussion, these also are divided from us by no unbridgeable gulf. That is, there is a continuum. These also have their corresponding sheaths in us, the knowledge sheath and the bliss sheath, which are not developed in us. Just as there was a time, and even now we see in animals, the mental body is not fully formed. In the human being, the mental body is more formed. So to our spiritual body is not fully formed currently, and it has to form, and the spiritual being has to emerge out of this mental being. And so this is the big picture. And then in this paragraph, he will describe the relationship between this spiritual consciousness and spiritual body and the mental consciousness and mental body, vital body, physical body, and how its pressure in us awakens the intuitive mind and all the possibilities that open for the completeness of human evolution. And he will link it with the very beginning where he describes the physical world, where he says, the moment something is involved in matter, it has to evolve and completely. And this evolution will not be complete until the full supramental which is involved will be fully evolved and revealed. And that will be the in the material universe, the full development. And we'll close with this and dwell on it for a while. Om